Hey guys, we're in James chapter 4, verse 13 this week through James 5, verse 6. We've just got this lesson and one more in the book of James for this semester. And we're going to be focusing this week on ungodliness. Ungodliness, which we're going to define as basically living your everyday life without acknowledging God's existence or acknowledging our dependence on God. So going through your everyday life without acknowledging that God exists or acknowledging that we are dependent on God in our everyday lives. That's what ungodliness is. That's how we're going to define it. I will unpack that some in our lesson. And I'm going to tee you guys up with a question that you're going to start with. The solution to ungodliness is obviously to acknowledge God more in our everyday lives, to become the kind of people that think about and acknowledge the fact that God exists and that we are dependent on Him more often as we go throughout our everyday life. That's the obvious solution, but how that practically works itself out is not quite as obvious. And so that's the question you guys are going to start with. How can we practically become more godly? Which means how can we practically become people that acknowledge God more often in our daily lives? And this is a question I would like for you guys to spend a good amount of time on. I've listed some fairly obvious answers here below, but this is a good chance for us as a community of believers to just brainstorm together to come up with ideas that fit with our lives. There's not necessarily a black or white answer here. There's a variety of ways that we could become more godly, that we could acknowledge God more often in our everyday lives. And I'm sure students have some good ideas about how we could do that, and have some unique ideas about how that would look in their lives and how that would look in the lives of Americans in 2022. So dwell on this question for a while, push students to really think critically, think about how would this work in my weekly life? How could I build things into my life that might encourage me to think about God more often? The things I've listed, again, are pretty simple. This gives a meaning to having a quiet time, particularly having one early in the morning. That's just a time, amongst other things, for you to acknowledge that God is there. He's real. We are dependent on Him. He is in control of what's going to happen in our day that's upcoming. Meals, praying before meals, that's the purpose behind why people do that. That's the intended purpose. It's lost that purpose a lot in a lot of ways in a lot of families, but that's what that's supposed to do, is redirect our minds back to God. We pause before we eat to recognize and thank God for what He's provided for us, to recognize that we're not completely self-sufficient, that God had a hand in bringing this meal. And the same thing as we grow in our knowledge and our belief that God is sovereign over all things, over the little details in our lives, that God actually cares about things, and we can't just compartmentalize God only into maybe the moral things that come up throughout our day, and everything else is kind of outside of God's sphere of influence. But we recognize and believe that there's a way that we can honor God and dishonor God in everything that we do, and that He cares about everything that we do. It matters to Him, and that He has a hand in controlling that. The more that we believe that, in theory, the more we should remember and acknowledge God throughout our daily lives. So the second question and third question kind of build off of that first one a little bit. A lot of the answers that you're going to be coming up with here are some habits and routines that you can kind of plug into your daily and weekly lives that help you redirect your mind to God. And there's an obvious inherent danger in routine, habitual things that are intended to do this. And this is a danger that we've all run into before, the danger of just having a regular everyday quiet time, having a regular time where we pray before every meal, having this regular phrase that James suggests where we say, Lord willing, I'm going to do this, or Lord willing, this will happen in a week. The danger is that these things can become formulaic because they're habits. They can just become things that we do regularly to try to check off the box, or just because they become routine. And when they become so routine and formulaic, they lose their meaning and their value because we can do them mindlessly, where we're not even thinking about it. We've all experienced that in praying before a meal. We just say a quick prayer. We're not even thinking about who we're praying to, who we're talking to. It actually doesn't fulfill its purpose, which is to redirect our minds back towards God. We're just doing it mindlessly. And that's a danger that we want to be aware of. And so question 3 is, how do we respond to that? We all know that that's a real possibility, that that's a real danger. What's the proper response? And obviously the proper response is not to just cut all of these things out of our lives. It's not to just eliminate praying before meals or to eliminate having a quiet time in the morning completely. We should do these things with a little bit more intentionality. We can build some things in maybe that help us pause and reflect on what's really going on, so that we can give some more focus and some intentionality to making sure that these don't just become mindless everyday habits and routines that we do. Then you're kind of switching gears in question 4, and you're going to ask students for a definition or an example of what over-spiritualizing something means. What does it mean to over-spiritualize something? And what we're kind of getting at here is just making something that doesn't inherently seem spiritual to be spiritual. Making something that's not obviously spiritual on the surface into something that is spiritual. The best way to define that may be for students to give examples, and there's a really broad range of things that people could say that is over-spiritualizing. People could say it's over-spiritualizing for someone to pray before they go on a road trip or go on long travels. Particularly, probably, hopefully, people that aren't Christians would say, that's stupid. Just drive. It's fine. You don't need to pray before you go on your road trip. That's over-spiritualizing. That's unnecessarily bringing in God to something that's not inherently spiritual. Same thing about someone recovering from a sickness, particularly like a small sickness. Somebody recovers from a cold and someone else wants to attribute that to God. God is the one who allowed you to recover. He's the one who had a hand in that. Praise God for the fact that he brought about this healing in your life. And someone else says, that's stupid. Probably says that hopefully in their head. That's over-spiritualizing. Like, why are you making God the healer of a common cold? They just took some Dayquil and they're fine now. So again, there's a broad range of things that we can consider over-spiritualizing, and this is something I'll talk about in my lesson, but it varies with culture. Audrey and I just came back from Africa. That is a culture that is much more spiritual, much more comfortable attributing daily successes to God, much more comfortable crying out to God for help in everyday common events. American Western culture, not so much. We are much more hesitant to bring God in to everyday life, to things that are not obviously inherently spiritual or moral. And so culture plays a big influence here. And really, I just want you guys on question 5 to enter into a discussion over this. There's a lot that you could get into. You can ask how this relates to our passage. Make sure that they understand that connection there. The connection is that James says that we should say, Lord willing, we'll do this. Lord willing, we'll do that. And a lot of people would say that's over-spiritualizing. Why can I not make plans for next week without acknowledging that God has a hand in that? Isn't that unnecessarily over-spiritualizing something? You can enter into a discussion here on, should we actually say Lord willing before any plan we have for the future? Or should we never say that? Is that just an idea, that kind of a concept that James is trying to exemplify? You can ask students, is over-spiritualizing a thing? When is it appropriate to say that's over-spiritualizing? And when is it our culture thinks that's over spiritualizing, but really it's not. If we believe that God is in control of all things, then no, attributing someone's recovery from a cold to God's sovereign hand is not over spiritualizing. That's actually kind of having an account for what reality really is, just bringing God into that. Lots of questions you could influence or insert here. Should we allow culture to influence us as Americans, as Westerners? Should we allow our culture to prevent us from making things more spiritual? Or should we push against that? How firmly should we push against that? So again, lots of questions you could get into here. I think that's an interesting discussion to have, and I want to give you guys some freedom to ask the questions kind of as they come along in your group. But enter into a good long discussion on that in questions 4 and 5. And then leave some time at the end. 5 minutes is probably sufficient. And you're just going to give some instruction to students. This is a lesson that's unique in the sense that it's almost certain all of us are ungodly, or it is certain all of us are ungodly to some degree. We do not all always acknowledge God. We do not all always recognize that we're dependent on God. Some of us probably less so than others, but we all have room for improvement here. And so we're just going to pause for some time for you to think and examine. Go through your daily and weekly life. When are the times where you're actually aware and thinking about God, and when are there times when you're not? And how frequent are those? So some time for students to internally examine their own lives, leaders to do the same thing, and then maybe on the back of your note sheet, if you're a journaling type person, or if you have a notebook, you can write down, here are some areas where just weekly, as I go throughout my school day, the entire day, that I never think about God, I never acknowledge God, and I want to work on that, or whatever it may be. Journaling, people can write that down, not required, but what we really want people to do is to examine themselves, examine their own lives, and then move into prayer, confessing to God that we're sorry that we don't acknowledge you and your control and our dependence on you as regularly as we should. Be specific about when you fail to do that, and then petition God, ask God for an increased awareness and acknowledgement of Him moving forward, an increased awareness this week as we go throughout our week. Would you help us to just regularly remember that you are there, that you exist, that we're dependent upon you? And so just have a couple minutes for personal reflection for both students and leaders. Look at our own lives, really think about how this applies to us, and then move into prayer to confess and ask God for help in the future. So that's what we have for you guys this week. I'll see you guys on Sunday.